Mason Cole did not lower his voice. In the center of a polished dining room beneath quiet chandeliers and careful eyes, he lifted a porcelain cup and threw its contents across his wife's chest. Coffee spread over Abigail Whitmore's silk blouse, dark and immediate. Conversation stopped. No one moved. She had refused him a credit card. Mason expected tears, an apology, compliance. Abigail only stood there, still composed, watching the stain settle. What Mason did not know, what no one in that room understood, was that the woman he had just humiliated controlled a $5 billion empire he would never touch. And this moment would cost him everything. If you believe dignity matters more than appearances, stay with this story. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is there. And if stories about quiet strength and justice speak to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what happens next. The marriage between Abigail Whitmore and Mason Cole looked from a distance like a familiar American success story, polished, respectable, and quietly envied. They lived in a glass-walled apartment overlooking the Hudson, the kind of place that reflected light differently depending on the hour. In the mornings, it was all pale gold and promise. In the evenings, it became a mirror, sharp, expensive, and unforgiving. Mason Cole fit perfectly into that reflection. He was, by most visible measures, a successful man. Senior partner at a mid-sized financial firm, well-dressed, articulate, and endlessly networked. His voice carried easily in rooms that mattered. He knew which handshakes to hold half a second longer, which jokes to deliver with restraint, and which names to mention at precisely the right moment. People described him as solid, reliable, driven, the kind of man who understood how the world worked and how to move within it without friction. Abigail, standing beside him, was often described differently. Graceful, some would say, though they meant quiet. Elegant, others offered, though they meant unobtrusive. Lucky, a few added, with a tone that suggested she had married into something she could never have built. She rarely corrected them. At social events, she wore neutral colors, soft ivory, charcoal, muted blue. Nothing that demanded attention. Nothing that competed. Her voice, when she used it, was measured and low, often lost beneath the hum of conversations Mason controlled with practiced ease. He introduced her simply. "My wife Abigail, never more, never less." And people accepted that framing because it was convenient, because it aligned with what they expected to see. Men like Mason, after all, were supposed to lead. Women like Abigail were expected to follow. The truth did not contradict this image. It simply existed somewhere far beyond it. At a charity gala hosted by Daniel Brooks, a venture capitalist known more for his guest list than his generosity, Mason moved through the room like a man accustomed to being watched. "Daniel," he greeted, clasping hands with easy familiarity. "You outdid yourself this time." Daniel laughed. "I try." "You bringing any new deals my way, Mason?" "Always," Mason replied with a confidence that suggested both promise and control. Abigail stood beside him, a step behind, not by instruction but by design. She listened. She observed. She noted the subtle shifts in tone when money was mentioned. The way Daniel's smile tightened when Mason spoke of liquidity, the hesitation, masked as humor. She noticed everything. What she did not do was interrupt. Kevin Hartley joined them moments later, his voice louder, his presence less refined but equally accepted. "Mason," Kevin said, clapping him on the shoulder, "heard your firm's been pushing into private placements." "Big move." "It's calculated," Mason replied. "We don't take risks we don't understand." Abigail's gaze lingered just briefly on that statement. Calculated. No risks. She said nothing. Kevin turned to her almost as an afterthought. "And you, Abigail, keeping him in line?" A light laugh followed, shared expected. Abigail smiled politely. "He manages quite well." It was the kind of answer that ended conversations rather than deepened them, and that too was intentional. Mason continued, speaking unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, that Abigail had already assessed more about Kevin's financial posture in 10 seconds than Kevin had revealed in 10 minutes. She had learned long ago that speaking truth in rooms built on assumption was rarely productive. Silence, on the other hand, had its uses. Back at their apartment later that night, the dynamic shifted, but only slightly. Mason loosened his tie, tossing it onto a chair with careless precision. "You could engage a little more," he said, pouring himself a drink. "People notice when you don't contribute." Abigail removed her earrings, placing them carefully in a small dish by the window. "I was listening." "That's not the same," Mason replied. It makes it look like you don't understand what's being discussed. The statement lingered, not sharp, not loud, but deliberate. Abigail turned to face him, her expression unchanged. Does it? Mason shrugged. Perception matters. It always came back to that. Perception. Image. Control. Abigail inclined her head slightly, as if acknowledging a point in a conversation she had no intention of continuing. I'll keep that in mind, she said. And she did. Not in the way Mason expected, but with a precision he never noticed. In the weeks that followed, their routine unfolded with the same quiet imbalance. Mason handled visible finances, the shared accounts, the visible expenses, the transactions that could be discussed casually in conversation. He reviewed statements with a confidence that came from familiarity, not scrutiny. Dinner at Le Bernardin last Thursday, he noted one evening scrolling through his phone. That was higher than usual. It was a client dinner, Abigail replied. He nodded, but not without adding, just keep an eye on it. It wasn't a command. It was something softer, more insidious, a suggestion framed as guidance. Abigail did not argue. Of course, she said. She did not mention that the amount in question represented less than a fraction of assets she had not touched in years. She did not mention that the account Mason monitored so closely was one of the smallest financial structures connected to her name. She let him believe what he needed to believe, because belief, she understood, was often more powerful than fact. At another gathering, this time smaller, more intimate, Mason spoke freely about financial discipline. People overspend because they lack structure, he said, leaning back with the ease of authority. You need oversight. Systems. Accountability. Kevin nodded. Exactly. Without that, money disappears. Mason gestured lightly toward Abigail. That's why I handle things the way I do. There was no malice in his tone. Not overtly. But there was ownership in it. A quiet assertion of control that went unquestioned because it sounded reasonable. Abigail sipped her water, her gaze steady. She did not correct him. Not when he implied control. Not when others assumed dependency. Not when the narrative settled into something both inaccurate and convenient, because correcting them would require explanation, and explanation would require exposure. She had spent years ensuring neither was necessary. Late that night, after the guests had left, and the apartment returned to its usual stillness, Abigail sat alone near the window. Below, the city moved in patterns, lights shifting traffic, flowing lives intersecting without pause. She opened her laptop, not to browse, not to distract herself, to record. A simple document. Date, time, location. She typed dinner with Kevin Hartley. Mason's statement regarding financial control. Witnesses present. She paused briefly, then continued. No emotion, no interpretation, just fact. She saved the file in a folder that already contained dozens of similar entries. Emails were archived. Messages were categorized. Receipts were stored. Not obsessively, not anxiously, but consistently. Because Abigail did not rely on memory when precision was required. And somewhere beneath the surface of what appeared to be a quiet, unequal marriage, a record was forming. Not for revenge, not for confrontation, but for clarity. Mason, in the other room, slept easily, confident in the structure he believed he controlled, certain of the roles he believed were fixed, unaware that the woman he thought he understood had never once mistaken silence for surrender, unaware that every word, every gesture, every small assumption had been seen, measured, and placed exactly where it belonged. And most of all, unaware that the balance of power in his marriage had never been what it seemed. There had been a time long before Mason Cole ever learned how to measure a room, when Abigail Whitmore was taught how to measure risk. Not in theory, not in language meant to impress, but in decisions that carried consequence long after the moment passed. Her father, Edward Whitmore, had not raised his voice often. He did not need to. Precision in his world replaced volume. Control is not what you show, he had told her once, standing beside a window very much like the one she now sat near. It is what remains when everything visible changes. Abigail had been 19 then, old enough to understand the words, not yet experienced enough to see how they would define her life. Edward Whitmore had built very little in his own name. That, too, had been intentional. The Whitmore wealth did not exist in ways most people recognized. There were no headlines, no public valuations, no visible ownership attached to a single figure. Instead, it lived in layered structures, trusts, nested within holding companies, which in turn held positions in firms that rarely appeared in news cycles. Energy, logistics, quiet technology infrastructure, private lending. The kind of investments that did not attract attention but quietly shaped markets over time. When Edward passed, the structure did not collapse. It shifted. Margaret Whitmore, his sister, became the stabilizing force behind what remained unseen. Margaret was not sentimental. She did not indulge grief publicly, nor did she allow it to disrupt function. The system holds, she told Abigail during the first formal meeting after the funeral, because it was built to. Abigail listened. Around them, attorneys from Carter and Lowell LLP moved through documents with practiced efficiency. Jonathan Carter himself, measured exact, sat across from her, outlining transitions that were less about inheritance and more about continuity. "You are not receiving something new," he explained. "You are stepping into something that has always included you." There was no ceremony in it. No grand declaration. Only responsibility, clearly defined, meticulously protected. Abigail did not resist it. But she did not rush toward it either. In the years that followed, she learned. Not publicly. Not visibly. She reviewed quarterly reports that most people would never see. She sat through briefings where decisions were discussed in terms of decades, not quarters. She understood the language of risk, not the kind Mason later spoke about at dinner tables, but the kind that required patience, restraint, and an absence of ego. She learned when to act. More importantly, she learned when not to. By the time she met Mason, Abigail had already stepped into a role that required her presence even when she chose not to exercise it fully. That choice had been deliberate. Mason entered her life in a way that felt at the time uncomplicated. He was confident without appearing arrogant, at least at first. He spoke clearly, listened when it mattered, and presented himself as someone building something of his own. There had been something appealing in that, not his ambition, but the idea that he was separate from the world she came from. With him, she did not have to explain layered ownership or strategic silence. She did not have to justify decisions that were invisible to everyone else. She could simply exist. And so she made a decision, not one announced, not one discussed, but one that would shape everything that followed. She stepped back, not entirely, never entirely, but enough. Control of active oversight shifted more heavily toward Margaret and the senior partners within Carter and Lowell. Abigail remained informed, always informed, but she stopped attending certain meetings, delegated certain approvals, allowed the structure to function without her direct presence. It did not weaken anything. The system had been designed for continuity. What it did was create distance, a life that looked from the outside ordinary. When she married Mason, that distance became part of the foundation of their relationship. He knew she came from money, but not how much. He knew there were family assets, but not where they sat. He knew she had access, but not that she chose not to use it. And because he did not ask the right questions, he never received the right answers. Abigail did not lie. She simply did not correct. "I prefer to keep things simple," she had told him once early in their relationship. Mason had nodded, interpreting simplicity as limitation. It was easier that way. Over time, his understanding of her settled into something comfortable, manageable. He saw her as someone who had grown up adjacent to wealth, not within its structure. Someone who benefited but did not direct. Someone who required guidance in matters he believed he understood better. She let that belief remain, because challenging it would have required explanation. And explanation, in her experience, rarely changed people who had already decided what they believed. What it did change was leverage. So she kept hers. Even as the marriage progressed, even as subtle shifts began to appear. There were moments, small, almost unnoticeable, when Mason's tone changed. Suggestions became instructions. Opinions became corrections. "You don't need to worry about that," he would say. "I've got it handled." At first it seemed protective. Then gradually it became something else. Restrictive. Abigail observed the transition without reacting to it immediately. Because reacting too early, she knew, often revealed more than it resolved. Instead, she adjusted. Not her behavior, her awareness. When Mason began reviewing expenses more closely, she allowed him access to accounts that revealed very little. When he spoke about financial structure, she listened not to learn but to understand what he believed. Belief again mattered more than fact, because belief shaped action, and action over time revealed truth. There were nights when she considered telling him, not everything, but enough to correct the imbalance that was slowly forming. She imagined the conversation, how it would begin, how it might shift the dynamic, how it could restore something closer to partnership. But each time she stopped, not out of fear, but out of clarity, because disclosure once given could not be undone. And she had not yet seen in Mason the kind of understanding that could hold that truth without distorting it. So she waited, not passively, but deliberately. Meanwhile, the structure behind her remained intact. Elise Grant, the financial advisor who had worked alongside Margaret for years, continued to send updates, brief, precise summaries of performance movement exposure. Abigail read them all. She responded when necessary, approved when required, questioned when something did not align. Her absence from public involvement did not equate to absence of control. It simply made that control invisible. Jonathan Carter ensured legal protections remained airtight. Every entity, every trust, every layer of ownership was maintained with the same discipline that had defined it for decades. There were no loose ends, no assumptions left untested, and no access granted without purpose. Mason, living within the visible layer of Abigail's life, never encountered any of this, because it had never been his to encounter. He operated within a version of reality that made sense to him, a marriage where he led, where he provided, where he understood the systems that mattered. Abigail did not disrupt that version, because for a time it allowed something else to exist, a possibility, that beneath assumption something real might still form. That partnership could emerge not from correction but from recognition. But recognition requires attention, and attention in Mason's case was increasingly directed elsewhere, toward perception, toward control, toward a version of success that depended on being seen rather than understood. Abigail watched that shift the way she watched everything, carefully, without interruption, without announcement, because she understood something Mason did not. That power does not diminish when hidden. It concentrates. And when revealed not through words but through consequence, it does not need to raise its voice. It simply changes the outcome. The first time Mason Cole asked to see a receipt, it had sounded almost reasonable. "Just for my records," he said, standing near the kitchen island, his tone casual, his attention divided between his phone and the half-finished glass of whiskey beside him. Abigail had handed it over without hesitation. There had been no argument, no tension. At the time, it had seemed like nothing more than preference. Structure, as he liked to call it. But structure, when repeated without question, tends to evolve into something else. Over time, the requests became more frequent, not aggressive, not overtly controlling, but consistent. "Can you forward me that invoice? Just double-checking, what was this charge for? We should probably tighten things a bit." Each statement taken alone was easy to dismiss. Together, they formed a pattern. Abigail noticed the pattern long before anyone else would have. She noticed the shift in his phrasing, the way we gradually became you, the way suggestions carried expectation, the way casual curiosity hardened into quiet oversight. She did not resist. Resistance, she knew, often triggered escalation. Instead, she complied. But she also recorded. Not in a way that drew attention, not in a way that disrupted routine. Simply, precisely. Date, time, context. March 12. Mason requested itemized breakdown of personal expense. Tone corrective. She did not add interpretation beyond what could be observed. Facts were stronger without embellishment. And more importantly, they were harder to dismiss. There were other moments. Smaller, sharper. At a dinner with colleagues, one of Mason's clients, a man named Richard Hale, conversation turned briefly toward investments. Richard spoke at length about diversification, about the volatility of emerging markets, about strategies that sounded confident but lacked depth. Abigail listened. When there was a pause, she offered a single sentence. "Long-term infrastructure tends to outperform short-term speculation in unstable regions." It was not a challenge, not even a correction, just an observation. Richard hesitated, then nodded slowly. "That's actually a fair point." Mason laughed lightly, cutting in before the conversation could shift. She reads articles, he said. Keeps her busy. There was no cruelty in his expression, but there was dismissal. Subtle, immediate, effective. The conversation moved on. Abigail did not re-enter it. Later in the car, Mason spoke without looking at her. You don't need to jump into those discussions. I wasn't jumping in, she replied. It just comes off like you're trying to prove something. She turned her gaze toward the window, watching the city pass in blurred reflections. I wasn't. Mason exhaled as if closing the matter. Just let me handle those conversations. Handle. The words settled between them, quiet but deliberate. Abigail did not respond. Because there was nothing to clarify. He had already decided what her participation meant, and explanation again would not change that. So she let the moment pass. And later that night she recorded it. Dinner with Richard Hale. Attempted contribution redirected. Mason reframed statement publicly. The entries grew. Not rapidly, but steadily. At times the behavior was almost imperceptible to anyone not looking for it. A comment made in passing. You probably wouldn't understand the tax implications. A correction offered in front of others. Let me explain it more simply. A joke delivered with a smile that softened its edge. She's not really into numbers. Each instance small enough to ignore. Each instance on its own defensible. But Abigail was not tracking individual moments. She was tracking accumulation. Patterns rarely reveal themselves in isolation. They emerge over time. There were also financial shifts, subtle at first. Mason began suggesting changes to how they managed shared accounts. Consolidation makes things easier, he said one evening, reviewing figures on his laptop. Less fragmentation. Abigail listened. What kind of consolidation? She asked. Moving things into accounts I can monitor more closely. It's just more efficient. Efficient. Another word that sounded neutral. Reasonable. She considered it for a moment, then nodded slightly. For shared expenses, that makes sense. Mason accepted the agreement without noticing its boundaries. He believed he had expanded access. In reality, he had only been given what was already visible. What remained unseen stayed that way. Because Abigail understood something he did not. Access is not determined by proximity. It is determined by design. And everything in her financial structure had been designed long before Mason entered her life. There was no point of vulnerability he could reach through suggestion. No door he could open simply by asking. Still, she allowed the appearance of control to remain. Because appearance in Mason's world mattered more than reality. And in that gap between the two, behavior revealed itself most clearly. Sophia Lynn noticed it before she said anything. As Mason's executive assistant, she had seen him in different contexts, under pressure, in negotiation, in moments of frustration. He was not an easy man to work for, but he was predictable. Until recently, one afternoon as Abigail stopped by the office to drop off a document Mason had forgotten, Sophia observed the interaction quietly. Thanks, Mason said, taking the folder. You didn't have to come all the way here. I was nearby, Abigail replied. Sophia offered a polite smile. Can I get you anything, coffee? I'm fine, thank you. Mason barely looked up. She won't stay. She doesn't like this environment. It was said lightly, almost joking, but it carried assumption. Abigail glanced briefly at Sophia, then back at Mason. I've spent time in similar environments, she said. Mason waved a hand dismissively. Not like this. The conversation ended there. Because he ended it. Sophia said nothing, but she noticed. Later she would recall the exchange with more clarity than Mason ever would. Because what passed as casual to him did not feel casual to those paying attention. Abigail left the office without comment. In the elevator she stood alone, her reflection steady in the mirrored walls. There was no visible reaction, no frustration, no sadness, only recognition. Because by now the pattern was no longer forming. It was established, and established patterns left unexamined tend to escalate. That evening she opened her laptop again. Another entry. Office visit. Statement minimizing prior experience. Witness Sophia Lynn. She paused, considering whether to add more. Then chose not to. Precision required restraint. Too much detail weakened clarity. She saved the file, closed the laptop, and sat in the quiet of the apartment, as the city moved below. Mason returned later than usual. "Tough day," he said, loosening his tie. "Clients are getting more demanding." Abigail nodded. "That tends to happen." He glanced at her as if expecting more. When none came, he continued, "I'm handling it." "I know," she said. The words were simple, neutral, but they carried something he did not recognize. Not doubt, not agreement, something else. Distance. Mason did not question it, because from where he stood, nothing required questioning. The structure of their marriage remained intact, the roles as he understood them unchanged. He still led, she still followed, and everything still appeared as it should. What he could not see, what no one at that point fully understood, was that beneath that appearance, a record had already begun to define a different reality. One built not on perception, but on evidence. And evidence, unlike assumption, does not need to be believed to matter. It only needs to exist. By the time Mason Cole realized he needed money, he did not describe it as a need. He described it as timing. "Short-term liquidity," he said over the phone, pacing near the window of his office. "It's not a loss. It's positioning." On the other end, the voice was less convinced. Daniel Brooks did not interrupt often, but when he did, it carried weight. "Positioning only works when you can hold long enough to recover." "I can," Mason replied too quickly. "This is temporary." There was a pause. "How temporary?" Daniel asked. Mason did not answer directly. "I've got options." The call ended without resolution. Mason lowered the phone slowly, his reflection staring back at him from the darkened glass. Outside, the city moved with its usual indifference. Inside, something tighter had begun to form. The deal had not collapsed all at once. It had eroded. A series of decisions, each defensible, each small enough to justify, had accumulated into something less stable than it appeared. A misread market shift. An overextended position. A reliance on projected returns that had not materialized when expected. None of it catastrophic, but together enough to create pressure. Pressure that required immediate relief. Mason did what he had always done in moments like this. He looked for control, and control in his understanding came from access. That evening he returned home earlier than usual. Abigail was in the kitchen reviewing something on her laptop, the soft glow of the screen reflecting in the glass behind her. She closed it as he entered, not abruptly, but with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to finishing tasks before transitioning to the next. "You're home early," she said. "Wrapped things up faster than expected," Mason replied, loosening his cufflinks. "We should talk." The phrasing was familiar, structured, directed. Abigail nodded slightly. "Of course." He poured himself a drink before continuing, as though the act itself helped organize his thoughts. "There's an opportunity," he began. "Short window, high return." Abigail waited. "I need to move quickly," he continued. "Which means I need access to additional funds, just temporarily." "From where?" she asked. Mason glanced at her as if the answer were obvious. "From us." The word settled between them. "Us." Abigail held his gaze. "Which account? The joint one isn't sufficient," he said. "I'll need you to use your card." Her expression did not change. "My card," she repeated. "Yeah," Mason said more firmly now. "Just to bridge the gap. It'll be covered within weeks." There it was. Assumption layered over urgency. Abigail understood both. She also understood something Mason did not. There are moments when a decision is not about the immediate request, but about what the request represents. She considered her response carefully. Not because she was uncertain, but because precision mattered. "I won't be able to do that," she said. The sentence was quiet, clear, without apology. Mason blinked as if recalibrating. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I won't be able to use my card for that," Abigail replied. There was no elaboration, no justification offered, just a boundary. Mason set his glass down, the sound slightly sharper than intended. "It's temporary," he said. "You're not losing anything." "That's not the issue," Abigail answered. "Then what is?" he pressed. She paused briefly, not searching for an answer, choosing how much of it to give. "It's not something I'm comfortable doing," she said. The response, measured and calm, only intensified what was building beneath Mason's composure. because comfort was not the variable he was operating within. Control was. "You're not comfortable," he repeated. "Abigail, this isn't about comfort. It's about practicality." She did not interrupt. "I handle our finances," he continued. "I understand what's needed here." The emphasis on understand was deliberate. Abigail's gaze remained steady. "I'm aware." "Then you know this makes sense," Mason said. "I know what you're asking," she replied. "And you're refusing," he said, the word sharper now. "I'm declining," Abigail corrected, her tone unchanged. The distinction mattered, even if Mason did not register it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The apartment, usually expansive in its quiet, seemed to narrow. Mason exhaled slowly, attempting to reset. "Is this about trust?" he asked. "Because if it is, that's a different conversation." "It's not about trust," Abigail said. "Then explain it to me," he demanded. She looked at him, not with resistance, but with clarity. "I don't need to explain every decision I make in order for it to be valid." The words were not confrontational, but they were final. And finality in that moment felt to Mason like opposition. He stepped back slightly, studying her as though seeing something unfamiliar. "When did this become a negotiation?" he asked. "It isn't," Abigail replied. "Then why does it feel like one?" he said. She did not answer immediately, because the answer would not change what he felt. "It feels different," she said finally, "because this is the first time I've said no." The statement landed with more weight than its volume suggested. Mason let out a short, incredulous laugh. "So that's what this is," he said. "You're making a point." "No," Abigail replied. "I'm making a decision." He shook his head, pacing once across the room. "You're overcomplicating something simple," he said. "This is how partnerships work. You support each other." "I agree," she said. "Then act like it," Mason snapped. The edge in his voice sharpened the space between them. Abigail did not flinch. Support, she understood, was not the same as compliance. But Mason had begun to conflate the two. "I do support you," she said. "In ways that matter." "This matters," he insisted. "It matters to you," she corrected. The distinction again was subtle, and again it widened the gap. Mason stopped pacing. "This is not the time for philosophy," he said. "I need a solution." Abigail met his gaze. "This is mine." There was no escalation in her tone, no raised voice, no visible emotion, only resolution. And that, more than anything, unsettled Mason, because it removed the variables he knew how to navigate. There was nothing to argue against, nothing to persuade, only a boundary that did not move. He picked up his glass again, finishing it in a single motion. "Fine," he said. "We'll revisit this." Abigail inclined her head slightly. "If you'd like," but they both understood something, even if only one of them could name it. This was not something that would be revisited. This was something that had shifted. Later that night, after Mason had retreated into the controlled quiet of his study, Abigail returned to the window. The city looked the same. Lights, motion, distance. She opened her laptop. Another entry. Request for credit card access. Declined. Escalation in tone. No agreement reached. She paused, then added one more line. First, explicit refusal. She saved the document, closed the screen, and sat in the stillness that followed. Not tense, not uncertain, but aware, because some moments do not announce themselves as turning points. They arrive quietly, defined not by what happens next, but by what will never be the same again. Morning arrived with the kind of clarity that often follows a night where nothing appears resolved. The Langford house had already begun to fill by the time Abigail Whitmore stepped inside. It was the sort of place where conversations were softened by design, low lighting, polished marble, quiet music that existed only to prevent silence from becoming noticeable. Business breakfasts, informal negotiations, discreet meetings. Reputation lingered in the air as much as the scent of coffee. Mason Cole had chosen it deliberately. Public but controlled. Visible but respectable. He was already seated when Abigail approached, reviewing something on his phone, with the focused detachment of a man reconstructing certainty. "You're late," he said without looking up. "I arrived at the time you suggested," Abigail replied, taking her seat. He glanced at his watch, then dismissed the point with a slight shrug. "Close enough." A server approached, placing coffee between them. White porcelain. Clean lines. Steam rising in thin, controlled spirals. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Mason set his phone down. "I thought about what you said," he began. Abigail waited. "I think you're overreacting," he continued. "This isn't complicated. I need access, you have it, and we move forward." The language had shifted overnight. Less discussion. More conclusion. Abigail folded her hands lightly in front of her. "My answer hasn't changed." Mason exhaled slower this time. "Abigail," he said, lowering his voice slightly, not out of restraint, but because of where they were. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "I'm not trying to make it anything," she replied. "I'm being clear." The distinction did not land. Or perhaps it did, and Mason chose not to engage with it. He leaned back slightly, studying her. "You trust me, don't you?" he asked. It was a different angle. Not financial, personal. Abigail met his gaze. "I understand you," she said. It was not the answer he expected. "That's not what I asked," Mason said. "No," she replied quietly. "It isn't." A brief silence followed. At a nearby table, someone laughed too loudly, too quickly. The sound cut through the space, then disappeared just as fast. Mason leaned forward again, his voice tightening. "This is a simple request," he said. "I'm not asking for permission. I'm asking for cooperation." Abigail did not respond immediately. Because the shift in language mattered. Permission, cooperation, two different things, often confused. "I'm not able to give you what you're asking for," she said. Again. The same sentence. The same tone. The same refusal. Mason's hand moved toward the coffee cup, then stopped. Something in his posture changed. Subtle, but visible. To someone watching closely. "You keep saying that," he said. "Like it's fixed." "It is," Abigail replied. That was the moment. Not loud, not sudden, but definitive. Mason's fingers tightened slightly around the handle of the cup. He had expected resistance, but not stillness, not this kind of unyielding calm. Because calm did not give him anything to push against. And without resistance, control becomes harder to assert. "You're embarrassing me," he said, his voice low but edged now with something less contained. Abigail's expression did not shift. "I'm not discussing this further," she said. The sentence was quiet, but it closed something, and Mason felt it. Around them, the room continued, servers moving, conversations flowing, the soft rhythm of a place designed to absorb tension without displaying it. But at their table, the space had narrowed. "You don't get to decide that," Mason said. "I already have," Abigail replied. There it was again. Finality. Not aggressive, not emotional, just present. Mason's jaw tightened. "You think this is strength?" he asked. Saying no in public like this, Abigail held his gaze. "I think it's clarity." The word seemed to land somewhere Mason did not know how to reach, and that more than the refusal itself triggered something sharper. Because clarity removes ambiguity, and ambiguity had always worked in his favor. Without it, there was only truth, and truth in that moment was not aligned with his expectation. He lifted the cup, not quickly, not impulsively, but with a kind of deliberate motion that suggested the decision had formed just seconds before it was carried out. The coffee had cooled slightly, but not enough. The movement was small, contained, almost controlled, until it wasn't. The liquid left the cup in a smooth arc, crossed the narrow space between them, and landed across Abigail's blouse. Silk absorbed it instantly, dark spreading through light fabric, heat following, a sharp intake of breath from somewhere nearby, not from her. The room stilled, not entirely, but enough. Enough for the shift to register. Enough for attention to gather without anyone openly turning. Mason set the cup down. The sound was soft, almost precise. He did not look away. Not immediately. Because for a brief moment, he expected something. A reaction. Shock. Anger. Submission. Something that would confirm the dynamic he believed he controlled. But Abigail did not move. Not at first. She looked down briefly, not at the stain itself, but at the way it settled. Then she reached for the napkin beside her, folded it once, pressed it lightly against the fabric. No rush, no visible panic. Across the room, Ethan Ward, the floor manager, had already begun moving toward them, his expression carefully neutral but his pace slightly faster than protocol required. "Ma'am," he said, as he approached. "Are you?" "I'm fine," Abigail replied before he could finish. Her voice was steady, clear, unaffected. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "We'll take care of this immediately." Another staff member appeared with fresh linens, discreet, efficient. At a nearby table, Laura Jenkins had lowered her cup slowly, her gaze fixed not on Mason but on Abigail. Watching, trying to understand what she was seeing. Because what she saw did not match what she expected. Abigail stood, not abruptly, not dramatically. She placed the napkin down, smoothed the edge of the table lightly with her fingertips, a small, almost habitual gesture. Then she looked at Mason, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something far more difficult to interpret. Recognition. "You don't need to wait," she said quietly. The sentence was simple, but it carried a meaning Mason did not immediately grasp. "I'm not finished," he replied. Abigail inclined her head slightly. "I am." No emphasis, no escalation, just conclusion. She turned, walked past Ethan, past the eyes that followed but did not interfere, past the moment that had already begun to define itself. Behind her, Mason remained seated, still, for a second longer than necessary. Then he reached for his phone, as if returning to something familiar could restore what had just shifted. What he did not notice, what he could not have known, was that the moment he believed he had controlled had already been captured. By the cameras positioned unobtrusively along the ceiling, by the staff trained to document irregularities, by the witnesses whose silence did not mean absence, and most importantly by Abigail herself. Not emotionally, but precisely. Because as she stepped out into the morning light, the warmth of the coffee fading against the fabric, one thing had already settled with absolute clarity. This was no longer a pattern. This was evidence. Abigail Whitmore did not return home immediately. The morning air outside the Langford house carried a faint chill, the kind that sharpened rather than softened thought. Traffic moved steadily along the avenue, indifferent to what had just occurred inside a room designed to conceal disruption. She paused at the curb for a moment, not out of hesitation but to establish sequence. Then she stepped into the waiting car. "Downtown?" the driver asked. "Yes," Abigail replied. "And then I'll need to make a stop afterward." Her voice was even. No urgency, no trace of what had happened minutes earlier. The driver nodded, pulling into traffic without further question. Inside the car, Abigail removed her phone from her bag. She did not scroll through messages. She did not replay the moment. Instead, she opened her contacts. There were names there that Mason had never seen. Not hidden, simply never discussed. She selected one. Jonathan Carter. The line connected on the second ring. "Good morning, Abigail," he said, his tone measured, already attentive. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you this early." "There was an incident," she said. She did not elaborate immediately, because Jonathan did not require excess detail to understand when something had shifted. "I'm listening," he replied. Abigail described the event as she always described everything. Chronologically, precisely. Location, time, behavior, witnesses. No adjectives, no interpretation. Jonathan did not interrupt. When she finished, there was a brief pause. "Was there physical injury?" he asked. "No," Abigail said. "Contact, but no lasting harm." "Understood." Another pause, short, deliberate. "Was the incident public?" he continued. "Yes." "Do you know if the location has surveillance?" "They do." Jonathan exhaled quietly. "Then we proceed with preservation," he said. Immediately. Abigail did not need clarification, but he gave it anyway. "I'll have a notice sent to the establishment requesting all footage from this morning be retained. We'll also request incident reports from staff and any internal documentation." "Yes," Abigail said. "Do you have any personal record?" he asked. "I will," she replied. The distinction mattered. She had not yet written it, but she would. "Good," Jonathan said. "Do not engage further with him today. If he contacts you, keep responses minimal. No escalation." "I understand." "We'll also begin compiling prior documentation," he added. "Anything you've retained, emails, messages, notes." "They're organized," Abigail said. "I assumed they would be." There was no praise in his tone, only acknowledgement. "Jonathan," she said after a moment, "I want everything preserved before anything is said." "Of course," he replied. "We don't announce action. We prepare it." The call ended without ceremony. Abigail lowered the phone. Outside, the city continued its movement unchanged, uninterrupted. Inside the car, she opened her laptop. The screen illuminated her reflection briefly, before shifting to the document she had maintained for months. She created a new entry. April 3, the Langford House. 9:12 a.m. Public incident. Mason Cole threw coffee across table following refusal of financial request. Witnesses present. Staff response initiated. She paused, then added surveillance confirmed. Preservation requested. She saved the file, closed the laptop. No hesitation, no second guessing. Because the moment had already moved beyond interpretation. It was now part of a record. Across the city, Mason Cole remained at the table longer than necessary. Not because he was reflecting, but because leaving too quickly would acknowledge something he was not ready to define. Ethan Ward approached again, more carefully this time. "Sir," he said, his tone neutral, "we'll need to complete an incident report." Mason looked up, irritation flickering briefly before settling into something more controlled. "There's no need," he said. "It was a misunderstanding." Ethan did not argue. But he did not step back either. "Company policy requires documentation," he said. "It's standard procedure." Mason held his gaze for a moment, then nodded as though conceding something minor. "Fine," he said. "Make it brief." Ethan inclined his head slightly. "It will be accurate," he replied. The distinction passed between them without further comment. At a nearby table, Laura Jenkins remained seated, her attention no longer disguised. She had seen enough, not just the action, but the response. And it was the response that stayed with her, because it had not aligned with what she understood about situations like that. There had been no reaction, no visible hurt, only departure, and something about that felt final. Mason left shortly after. By the time he reached his car, his phone had already begun to fill with messages. Not from Abigail, from others. "Daniel Brooks, everything okay? Heard something happened at Langford. Kevin Hartley, call me when you get a chance." Mason read them quickly, his jaw tightening. Information had already moved, faster than expected. He typed a brief response to Daniel. Nothing serious. Overblown. He did not respond to Kevin. Not yet. Instead, he opened his messages with Abigail. The thread remained unchanged from the night before. He typed, "We need to talk," then paused, deleted it, typed again. "That wasn't necessary this morning." He stared at the screen, then added, "You made it worse than it needed to be." He sent it. Waited. No response. Minutes passed. Still nothing. Mason set the phone down, exhaling sharply. Silence in his experience usually meant delay, not refusal. But something about this silence felt different. Less reactive. More intentional. Back in the car, Abigail's phone vibrated once. She glanced at the screen. Read the message, then locked the phone again without replying. Jonathan's instruction had been clear. Minimal engagement, no escalation. She did not need to respond to statements that reframed what had already occurred, because reframing did not change fact. And fact, once documented, did not require defense. Her next call was shorter. "Elise," she said when the line connected. "Elise Grant speaking. It's Abigail." A slight shift in tone. "Of course. How can I help? I need all accounts reviewed," Abigail said. "Access logs, recent inquiries, any unusual activity connected to Mason." There was no hesitation. "I'll begin immediately," Elise replied. "Do you want restrictions placed?" "Not yet," Abigail said. "Just visibility." "Understood." A pause. Then more carefully, "Is this precautionary or—" "It's time to prepare," Abigail said. Elise did not ask further questions. "Then we'll proceed accordingly." The call ended. By the time Abigail arrived at Carter and Lowell's downtown office, the day had fully settled into motion. Jonathan was already waiting. He did not greet her with concern. He did not ask how she felt. Instead, he gestured toward the conference room. "Let's begin," he said. Inside, documents were already being assembled, templates prepared, requests drafted, not reactions, preparations. Abigail took her seat, folded her hands lightly on the table, and began outlining what would come next. Not emotionally, not impulsively, but with the same clarity she had carried since the moment the coffee left the cup. Because what Mason believed had been a moment of control had already become something else entirely. A starting point for a process he could not stop and did not yet understand. By the time Mason Cole arrived at his office, the structure he relied on had already begun to shift in ways he could not yet see. The building itself stood as it always had, glass and steel arranged to suggest permanence, success, and control. Mason moved through the lobby with the same measured confidence he had practiced for years. Nodding briefly to familiar faces, acknowledging greetings without slowing his pace. From the outside, nothing had changed. His posture remained steady. His expression remained composed. His reputation, at least for the moment, remained intact. But stability, like confidence, often depends on what remains unseen. Inside his office, the quiet felt different. Not heavier, not overtly tense, but subtly altered. Mason closed the door behind him and placed his phone on the desk, then immediately picked it up again, as if expecting something to have resolved itself in the brief time he had not been looking. It had not. Messages continued to accumulate. Some were casual inquiries, framed carefully to avoid direct confrontation. Others carried a more pointed curiosity, disguised as concern. Daniel Brooks had sent another message, shorter, this time asking if Mason had time to talk. Kevin Hartley had called twice. A third number Mason did not immediately recognize had left a voicemail. Information once released into the right environment does not stay contained. Mason understood that. He had built part of his career on that principle. Managing perception was often less about controlling facts and more about controlling how quickly they spread. He opened Daniel's message first, a simple request to connect followed by a single line that lingered longer than the rest. "He heard you had a situation this morning." Mason read it twice, then set the phone down again. He moved to his desk, opened his laptop, and pulled up financial reports, as though returning to numbers would restore something predictable. Figures populated the screen in clean rows and columns. Accounts, positions, projections. All the elements he relied on to maintain a sense of control. At first glance, everything appeared manageable. Then he began to look more closely. The issue was not that he lacked assets. It was that his assets were not positioned for immediate use. Capital had been allocated in ways that assumed time would be available. Investments that required patience had been treated as if they could provide liquidity on demand. The distinction mattered more now than it had before. Short-term obligations had begun to press against long-term structures. And pressure, when not addressed quickly, tends to compound. Mason leaned back in his chair, studying the numbers as if extended attention might alter them. He recalculated timelines, adjusted projections, considered options that had not been necessary before. None of them offered the simplicity he had expected when he first described the situation as temporary. Temporary implied control. What he was seeing required something else. He thought briefly of Abigail. Not in terms of the morning, not immediately, but in terms of access. He had always understood their shared finances as an extension of his own system. Something that could be directed, adjusted, utilized when needed. The refusal the night before had disrupted that assumption, but he had interpreted it as resistance, not as a boundary that would hold. Now, sitting in front of numbers that did not align as cleanly as they once had, that distinction began to matter. He opened the shared account overview again. The balance remained exactly as expected. Transactions were unchanged. Nothing had moved without his knowledge. That at least confirmed one thing. Abigail had not taken any action overnight. He interpreted that as stability. What he did not consider was that stability can exist on multiple levels at once, and not all of them are visible. Across the city, in a separate office defined less by visibility and more by function, Elise Grant reviewed a different set of numbers. Her workspace was quieter, intentionally so. No glass walls, no open floor plan designed for display. Files were organized with precision. Screens arranged not for presentation but for efficiency. The kind of environment where decisions were made without needing to be seen. She had already received confirmation from Abigail. Prepare. That single instruction was sufficient. Elise accessed secured systems reviewing account logs across multiple entities that did not carry Abigail's name in any obvious way. Layers of ownership unfolded methodically, each connected to the next through structures that had been designed long before Mason Cole had entered Abigail's life. There was no urgency in Elise's movements, only thoroughness. She checked access points first. No unauthorized entries, no unusual login attempts. That confirmed that Mason had not tried to reach beyond what he believed was available to him. He was still operating within the limits of his understanding. Next, she reviewed recent inquiries. A small number had been made to institutions connected to Abigail's visible accounts. Standard, almost routine, but when viewed in sequence, they suggested a pattern of increasing attention. Not yet interference, but approaching it. Elise documented everything: timestamps, points of access, frequency. Then she began compiling a report, not for immediate action, but for clarity, because clarity, once established, determines what comes next. Back in Mason's office, the sense of pressure had begun to shift into something more defined. He picked up his phone again and called Daniel. The line connected after a few rings. Daniel said, his tone neutral but not casual. "I was wondering when you'd call." "It's nothing," Mason replied immediately. "A minor situation that got exaggerated." Daniel did not respond right away. "I've heard different versions," he said finally. "That's the problem," Mason replied. "People hear something out of context and suddenly it becomes something else." Another pause. Daniel said more carefully, "Now, this isn't just about context. You know how this works. Optics matter." "I'm aware," Mason said, the edge returning to his voice. "And I'm handling it." Daniel exhaled quietly. "Just make sure you are," he said, "because right now it doesn't look controlled." The call ended shortly after. Mason set the phone down with more force than necessary. Control. The word had begun to appear more frequently than he was comfortable with, because it implied something he was not prepared to acknowledge. That control was no longer absolute. He stood, moving toward the window, looking out at the city as if distance might restore perspective. From this height, everything appeared ordered. Traffic moved in lines. Buildings held their shape. Nothing suggested instability. But perspective, like perception, can conceal as much as it reveals. Mason turned back to his desk, his attention returning once more to the numbers. He began to consider alternatives: short-term loans, private arrangements, liquidation of certain positions. Each option carried cost. Each required negotiation. Each reduced his margin of control. And underlying all of them was the same realization, forming slowly but steadily. He had built a system that depended on timing, and timing had begun to shift beyond his reach. What Mason did not yet understand was that the system he had built was never as stable as the one he had overlooked. Because while his structure relied on projection, Abigail's had always relied on design. And design, when executed with discipline, does not react to pressure. It anticipates it. As the day continued, Mason remained at his desk, recalculating, adjusting, attempting to restore alignment. Across the city, Abigail's systems continued to move in quiet coordination. No announcements, no visible changes, only preparation. Because the difference between appearance and reality had begun to widen. And in that widening space, one structure would hold. The other would begin slowly and without spectacle to give way. By late afternoon, the documentation had begun to take shape. Not as a narrative, not as an argument, but as a structure of facts arranged in sequence. Jonathan Carter preferred it that way. Emotion complicated things that evidence could resolve more cleanly. In his experience, the most effective cases were not the loudest ones, but the ones that required the least interpretation. Abigail sat across from him in the conference room at Carter and Lowell, her posture unchanged from when she had first arrived. A folder lay open in front of her, though she had not turned a page in several minutes. She was not reading in the conventional sense. She was confirming alignment. Dates, timestamps, names, everything needed to exist in relation to something else. Jonathan placed a printed set of emails on the table between them. "These are the first group we pulled from your archived accounts," he said. "There are more, but this set establishes a pattern clearly enough to begin." Abigail lowered her gaze to the pages. The emails were not dramatic. They did not contain explicit threats or overt declarations of control. What they contained was something quieter, and in many ways more effective. A tone that shifted gradually over time. Language that began as suggestion and moved step by step into expectation. She recognized each one, not because they were memorable, but because she had preserved them. Jonathan continued, his voice even. What matters here is not any single message. It's the accumulation. We are not proving an isolated incident. We are establishing a consistent behavioral pattern tied to financial pressure and control. Abigail nodded slightly. He turned one of the pages toward her, indicating a specific exchange. "This one is important," he said. "Read it in sequence." Abigail followed the thread. The first message had been sent by Mason several months earlier. It began simply, "We should streamline how we handle spending. It's inefficient the way things are now." Her response had been brief. "What would you suggest?" Mason's reply had come quickly. "Let me take a more active role. I'll make sure everything stays aligned." At the time, it had not stood out, not on its own, but the messages that followed shifted in tone. "You need to run larger expenses by me first. I don't want surprises when I review statements. They should be more disciplined about this." Each statement framed as reasonable, each one narrowing space. Jonathan tapped the page lightly. "This is where the language changes," he said, "from suggestion to directive. It's subtle but consistent." Abigail turned to the next set. Another thread. Different context. Same pattern. This one was more direct. "I don't understand why you would spend this much without checking with me." That had been followed by a second message sent minutes later. "It's not about the amount. It's about structure." Abigail's response had been measured. "It was within our agreed range." Mason's reply had come shortly after. "That range needs to change." Jonathan allowed a moment to pass before speaking again. "What we see here is progression," he said. He reframes control as structure. He reframes oversight as responsibility. Over time, those distinctions blur. Abigail did not look up. She did not need to. She had already seen the pattern forming long before it was placed in front of her in printed form. Jonathan continued, "There's another thread I want you to review." He handed her a second set of pages. "These are more recent," he said. "The language is less restrained." Abigail read. The shift was clear. "Why are you making this difficult? I need you to cooperate on this. This isn't optional if we're going to function as a unit." She paused briefly at the last line. Not because of what it said, but because of how it said it. Jonathan observed her carefully. "This is where it becomes relevant to your current situation," he said. "The request for the credit card does not exist in isolation. It follows a pattern of increasing pressure tied to financial access." Abigail placed the pages back on the table. Her hands rested lightly against the edge of the folder. No tension, no visible reaction, only recognition. "It's consistent," she said. Jonathan nodded. "That's what matters," he replied. "Consistency creates clarity." He leaned back slightly, folding his hands. In a legal context, isolated incidents can be dismissed. Patterns are harder to ignore. Abigail understood that, not because Jonathan explained it, but because she had built her own approach around the same principle. Patterns reveal intent, and intent, once established, defines outcome. Jonathan reached for another document. "This next part is preliminary," he said, "but it will become important." He slid a summary across the table. These are cross-references between his messages and financial inquiries made through shared channels. Abigail glanced down. Dates aligned. Requests matched timing. Moments of pressure corresponded with periods of financial strain. The connection was not speculative. It was structural. "He increases pressure when his exposure increases," Jonathan said. "That's not unusual, but combined with the tone in these messages, it becomes relevant." Abigail traced one line with her eyes. A message from Mason asking for increased oversight had been sent within hours of a flagged position in one of his accounts. Another demand for cooperation had followed a failed transaction attempt. She closed the folder. Not abruptly, but decisively. "What's the next step?" she asked. Jonathan did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied her for a moment. Not assessing emotion, assessing readiness. "We continue building," he said. "We gather the remaining communications, secure all relevant financial records, and prepare for formal action." Abigail nodded. No hesitation. "Do you anticipate resistance?" she asked. Jonathan allowed a slight pause. "Yes," he said, "but not in the way he expects." She understood, because Mason's resistance, when it came, would likely be based on perception, on argument. on reinterpretation, but the structure they were building did not rely on interpretation. It relied on evidence. And evidence, once established, does not require agreement to exist. Jonathan closed his own folder. "I'll have a full draft prepared within 48 hours, he said. "In the meantime, maintain distance. Do not engage beyond what is necessary." "I won't," Abigail said. There was nothing more to add. The meeting concluded without ceremony. No concluding remarks. No reassurances. Only movement toward the next stage. As Abigail stood and prepared to leave, Jonathan spoke once more. "Abigail," he said. She turned slightly. "This is not about escalation," he said. "It's about definition." She met his gaze. "I know," she replied. And she did. Because what had begun as a series of small, controlled observations had now become something else. A structure, defined not by what she felt, but by what could be shown. Outside, the city had shifted toward evening. Light softened against the buildings, shadows lengthening across the streets. Abigail stepped out of the office and paused briefly, not to reflect, but to orient. Then she continued forward. Behind her, the documentation remained. Growing, aligning, preparing. And somewhere across the city, Mason continued to operate within a version of events that had already begun to separate from reality. Because while he still believed this was a situation that could be explained, managed, or reframed, the truth had already moved beyond explanation. It had entered record, and once something enters record, it does not disappear. It waits until it is needed. The shift did not happen all at once. It rarely does. What begins as a single moment, witnessed by a handful of people, often moves quietly at first, carried through conversations that are careful, indirect, and deliberately incomplete. By the time it reaches those who matter, it has already changed shape. By the next morning, the incident at the Langford house had moved beyond the room where it occurred. Not publicly, not yet, but within the circles that Mason Cole relied on, it had begun to settle into something less controllable. At the hotel itself, the internal report had already been filed. Ethan Ward sat in a small office behind the main floor, reviewing the documentation one more time before submitting it through official channels. He was not a man inclined toward exaggeration. His role required precision, neutrality, and consistency. He read the report again. Time of incident. Location. Individuals involved. Observed action. There was no interpretation, only description. He had included the names of staff present, along with a note confirming that surveillance footage had captured the event from multiple angles. Company policy required that the footage be preserved. It would not be altered, not reviewed casually, and not released without formal request. Ethan signed the document, saved it, and sent it forward. In the dining room, Laura Jenkins returned to her usual table. She had not intended to think about the incident again, but she found that she could not dismiss it as easily as she had expected. It was not the act itself that lingered. She had seen worse in different contexts. What stayed with her was the absence of reaction. Abigail's stillness had unsettled her more than the coffee. Later that morning, Laura mentioned it to a colleague in passing. "Something happened here yesterday," she said. "A man threw coffee at his wife." Her colleague looked up surprised. "What happened after he asked?" Laura paused briefly. "She left," she said. "That's it." Laura considered the question. "Yes," she replied. That was enough. The conversation ended there, but the detail remained, because it did not fit the usual pattern, and things that do not fit tend to be remembered. Across town, Sophia Lynn sat at her desk reviewing Mason's schedule for the day. She had already seen the messages, not directly, but through the subtle adjustments that followed them. 2 meetings had been rescheduled. 1 had been canceled entirely. A 3rd had been moved from in-person to a call. Sophia understood the pattern. When Mason began adjusting his visibility, it usually meant something required attention. She did not ask questions. That was not her role, but she paid attention. Later that morning, Mason stepped into the office. His expression was controlled but not relaxed. "Sophia," he said, setting his briefcase down. "Push the Henderson meeting to next week." "It's already been moved," she replied. He paused. "Good," he said. "And cancel the lunch with Kevin." Sophia nodded. "Done." There was a brief silence. Then more carefully she added, "Is everything all right?" The question was neutral, professional, but not entirely without context. Mason looked at her. For a moment it seemed he might dismiss it. Then he spoke. "Just handling a situation," he said. Sophia inclined her head slightly. "I understand." She did not press further, but the answer, combined with what she had observed, aligned too closely to ignore. By midday, she had received a call from someone she recognized but had not expected. "Ethan Ward." "Sophia," he said when she answered. "I wanted to confirm contact details for Mr. Cole." Her posture straightened slightly. "May I ask the context?" she said. "It relates to an incident report from yesterday," Ethan replied. "Standard procedure." Sophia did not respond immediately, but she understood. "Yes," she said, "I can provide that." As she gave the information, her mind moved quietly through what she already knew. Not conclusions, not judgments, just alignment. Because information, when it comes from different directions, tends to reinforce itself, and reinforcement creates clarity. Across the city, Abigail's name had not yet entered these conversations. Not directly, but her presence was already there. In the absence she left behind, in the consistency of what others had observed, and in the contrast between expectation and reality. Mason, meanwhile, attempted to regain control through familiarity. He spent the early afternoon in calls, speaking with clients, partners, and contacts whose perception of him mattered. His tone remained steady, measured, confident. When the topic approached the incident, he reframed it. "It was a misunderstanding," he said more than once, "taken out of context." Some accepted that explanation, at least on the surface. Others did not challenge it, but they did not fully accept it either. Because explanation requires alignment with observation, and what had been observed did not align easily with what was being described. Kevin Hartley called again. This time Mason answered. "You've been hard to reach," Kevin said. "Busy," Mason replied. There was a brief pause. "I heard something happened," Kevin continued. Mason exhaled lightly. "It's nothing," he said. "Personal matter that got blown out of proportion." Kevin hesitated. "I'm not asking as a client," he said. "I'm asking as someone who's been in the room with you." Mason did not respond immediately. Kevin continued. "You sure you've got it under control?" The question lingered. "Not confrontational, but not dismissible." "Yes," Mason said finally. Kevin did not push further. "All right," he said. "Just be careful how this plays." The call ended shortly after. Mason remained seated, his phone still in his hand. "Careful how this plays." The phrase repeated itself, because it implied something he was beginning to recognize, that this was no longer just about the moment itself. It was about how that moment would be interpreted. And interpretation, once shared, is difficult to contain. Later that afternoon, Sophia entered his office with a document. "There's a request for confirmation of details," she said, placing it on his desk. Mason glanced at it. "Langford House. Incident report." His expression tightened slightly. "They're formalizing it," he said. "Yes," Sophia replied. He picked up the paper, scanning it quickly. Names, time, description. It was all there. Not exaggerated, not softened, simply recorded. Mason set it down. "They're overreacting," he said. Sophia did not respond, because agreement was not required, only acknowledgement. As she turned to leave, she paused briefly. "Mr. Cole," she said. He looked up. "There were witnesses," she added. The statement was simple, but it carried weight, because it removed ambiguity. Mason nodded once. "I'm aware," he said. Sophia left the office, closing the door quietly behind her. Inside, Mason remained still for a moment. Then he leaned back in his chair, his gaze returning to the document. For the first time since the incident, the structure he relied on began to feel less certain. Not broken. Not yet. But no longer fixed. Because what had once been a private dynamic had now entered a space where others could see it. And once seen, it could not be unseen. Across the city, Abigail continued her day without interruption. No calls. No statements. No attempt to influence what was already moving forward. Because influence in her understanding did not come from response. It came from preparation. And preparation, once complete, does not need to be visible to be effective. The witnesses had begun to speak. Not loudly, not publicly, but clearly enough. And clarity, once established, does not require repetition. It builds, quietly, until it becomes undeniable. The evidence did not arrive dramatically, nor did it demand attention through volume or urgency. Instead, it assembled itself with a kind of quiet inevitability, each piece aligning with another until the structure it formed no longer required explanation. What had once been separate observations, individual recollections, and isolated records began to converge into something far more difficult to dismiss. Inside Carter and Lowell, the process moved forward with disciplined precision. Jonathan Carter had no interest in spectacle, and neither did the team working under him. Every document was reviewed not for what it suggested, but for what it could withstand under scrutiny. Every timestamp was verified, every file traced to its source, every gap identified and addressed. There was no room for assumption, and no reliance on interpretation where verification was possible. Abigail sat at the far end of the conference table as the materials were presented, not as a participant seeking validation, but as someone confirming alignment. Her presence did not alter the pace of the room. It simply ensured that nothing proceeded without clarity. Jonathan placed a tablet on the table and turned it slightly so it faced her. "This is the footage from the Langford house," he said, his tone, even his expression, unchanged. "We've received confirmation of authenticity and full retention from the hotel's legal department. Chain of custody has been documented." He did not ask if she wanted to watch it. He knew she would. Abigail reached forward and pressed play. The video began without sound at first, capturing the controlled environment of the dining room. Guests seated in careful arrangements, staff moving with quiet efficiency, light reflecting off surfaces designed to soften attention. Then the frame centered on the table where she and Mason had been seated. She watched herself enter, take her seat, fold her hands. She watched Mason's posture, the way he leaned forward slightly, the shift in his shoulders as the conversation progressed. There was nothing exaggerated in his movements, nothing that would immediately signal escalation to an outside observer. Then the moment arrived. The movement of his hand, the lift of the cup, the arc of liquid crossing the space between them. Even without sound, the impact was unmistakable. The stillness that followed appeared almost unnatural on screen, as if the room itself had paused in response. Jonathan spoke only after the clip ended. "We also have the audio version," he said. "It's less clear, but portions of the conversation are audible." Abigail nodded once. "Play it." This time the voices came through in fragments. Not every word was distinct, but enough carried through to establish tone sequence and intent. Mason's insistence, his repeated framing of the situation as practical necessity, and finally the shift in his voice just before the action occurred. It was not what he had said that mattered most. It was how he had said it. The certainty, the expectation, the absence of hesitation. When the clip ended, the room remained quiet for a moment longer than necessary. Not out of discomfort, but out of recognition. Jonathan tapped the screen lightly, bringing up a separate file. "We've synchronized the footage with your written record," he said. "The timestamps align precisely with your entry." Abigail glanced at the comparison briefly. There was no discrepancy. "I expected they would," she said. Jonathan allowed a small pause, then continued. "There is also an audio file from a previous incident. This one was recorded independently." He slid a second device toward her. "This was preserved from a voicemail he left 3 weeks ago," he explained. "The content is relevant to financial pressure." Abigail pressed play. Mason's voice came through more clearly this time, unfiltered by ambient noise or distance. It carried a tone that differed from the one he used in public, less controlled, more direct. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said in the recording. "If we're going to function as a unit, I need you to stop second-guessing and just follow through. I shouldn't have to explain this every time." The message ended without conclusion, as though it had been cut off mid-thought. Abigail set the device down. There was no visible reaction, but the alignment was complete. Jonathan folded his hands on the table. Combined with the emails, this establishes a consistent pattern of financial pressure, expectation of compliance, and escalation when that compliance is not given. Abigail met his gaze, and the incident itself, Jonathan's response, was immediate. It confirms the pattern moved from verbal to physical expression. There was no emphasis in his voice, no attempt to dramatize, because the evidence did not require it. Across the city, Mason had not yet seen any of this, but he was beginning to feel its effect. By mid-afternoon, the calls had changed in tone. Where earlier there had been curiosity, now there was distance. Conversations that would normally extend into discussion ended more quickly. Questions were framed more carefully and in some cases not asked at all. Mason recognized the shift, though he did not yet fully understand its source. He attributed it at first to timing. Markets had been volatile. Clients were cautious. Situations required attention. It was easy to believe that external factors explained the change. But the pattern did not align with external factors alone. It aligned with perception, and perception, once altered, affects everything connected to it. He sat in his office, reviewing the same documents he had opened that morning, but the numbers no longer carried the same sense of control. Each calculation led to another consideration, each adjustment, revealing a new variable that had not been accounted for previously. He reached for his phone again and opened his messages with Abigail. Still no response. The silence had extended beyond what he considered reasonable. He typed another message, this time more direct. "We need to resolve this today." He sent it and waited. Minutes passed. No reply. The absence of response began to feel less like delay and more like a decision. Back at Carter and Lowell, Jonathan closed the final file and leaned slightly forward. "This is sufficient to proceed," he said. "We have documentation, corroboration, and verified evidence. The next step is formal filing." Abigail listened without interruption. "There will be a response," Jonathan continued. "Likely immediate, possibly aggressive in tone. He will attempt to reframe, to minimize, to question context." Abigail nodded once. "That's consistent." Jonathan allowed a brief pause before adding, "The difference now is that context has already been established." She understood. Because context, when supported by evidence, does not rely on argument. It defines it. Jonathan gathered the documents into a single folder, aligning them with the same precision that had guided the entire process. "We move forward tomorrow," he said. "Everything is prepared." Abigail stood, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had already considered what came next. As she turned to leave, Jonathan spoke once more. "Abigail," he said. She paused. "This is the point where most people react," he said. "You haven't." She met his gaze. "I've been preparing," she replied. Jonathan inclined his head slightly. "I know," he said. Outside, the city continued as it always did, unaffected by the alignment taking place behind closed doors. Traffic moved, conversations unfolded, and the surface of things remained unchanged. But beneath that surface, the structure had shifted. The evidence was no longer separate. It was unified. And once unified, it no longer required interpretation. It simply required action. Mason, still unaware of the full extent of what had been assembled, continued to operate within a narrowing space of control. He believed there was still time to resolve the situation. What he did not yet understand was that resolution had already begun. It had just not involved him. The filing did not begin with a confrontation. There was no raised voice, no dramatic declaration, no final conversation intended to mark the end of something that had already been over for longer than either of them had acknowledged. Instead, it began with structure, with documents arranged in a sequence that reflected not emotion, but fact. At Carter and Lowell, the process moved forward exactly as Jonathan Carter had outlined. Every page had been reviewed more than once. Every reference had been cross-checked against its source. The language of the filing was precise, restrained, and deliberate in its clarity. Abigail arrived just before 9 in the morning, dressed as she always was, without excess, without signal. There was nothing in her appearance that suggested escalation or conflict. If anything, she appeared more composed than usual, as though the decision had already settled into something that no longer required active thought. Jonathan met her in the conference room with a folder already prepared. "This is the final draft," he said, placing it in front of her. "We'll walk through it once more before submission." Abigail took her seat and opened the document. The first pages outlined the legal basis of the filing: dissolution of marriage, financial separation, protective measures tied to documented behavior. There were no unnecessary details, no descriptive language that extended beyond what could be supported. The incident at the Langford house was included not as an isolated event, but as a point within a broader pattern that had already been established through emails, audio records, and documented observation. Jonathan guided her through each section, not to explain, but to confirm. Here, he said, indicating a paragraph midway through the document, we reference the escalation point. It is supported by both visual and audio evidence. There is no reliance on interpretation. Abigail read the section carefully. The wording was exact. It did not assign motive. It did not speculate. It described sequence, action, and outcome. It's accurate, she said. Jonathan nodded and turned to the next section. This outlines financial protections, he continued. Temporary restrictions on shared accounts, notification requirements for attempted access, and preservation of all relevant financial structures. Abigail's gaze remained steady as she read. None of this was unfamiliar. What mattered was that it was now formal, defined, irreversible in its direction. Elise has already confirmed that all underlying structures are secure, Jonathan added. There is no exposure beyond what is already visible. Abigail closed the folder briefly, then opened it again, reviewing the final pages. There were no surprises, only confirmation. Proceed, she said. Jonathan did not ask if she was certain. He had already assessed that. Instead, he signaled to one of the associates waiting outside. Within moments, the necessary steps were set in motion. Documents were transmitted through secure channels. Notifications were prepared in accordance with legal requirements. The process, once initiated, moved forward without pause. Across the city, Mason Cole was in the middle of a meeting when the first indication reached him. It did not arrive as a call. It arrived as a notification, a message from his attorney. Urgent. Call me immediately. Mason glanced at the screen briefly, irritation flickering across his expression. He silenced the notification and returned his attention to the conversation at hand. The client seated across from him was discussing projections, outlining expectations that required focus. But the message remained in the back of his awareness. Persistent. Unresolved. When the meeting concluded, Mason did not delay. He stepped into his office, closed the door, and returned the call. What is it? He asked. His attorney's voice was measured but not neutral. We've received notice, he said. Your wife has filed. The words settled without immediate impact. Filed what Mason asked, though he already understood. Petition for dissolution, the attorney replied, along with supporting documentation and financial motions. Mason remained silent for a moment. Then he spoke. That's not necessary, he said. This is being handled. There was a brief pause on the other end. It's already been filed, the attorney said. This is no longer informal. Mason exhaled slowly, his hand tightening slightly around the phone. What's included? He asked. Documentation of prior communications, the attorney replied. Financial records. Audio. Video from the incident yesterday. Mason's gaze shifted toward the window. For the first time, the structure he had relied on began to feel less stable. They're building a pattern, the attorney continued. Not just referencing a single event. Mason did not respond immediately, because what he was hearing did not align with what he had expected. He had anticipated reaction, not preparation. What's our position? He asked finally. There was a pause. We need to review everything in detail before responding, the attorney said. But based on what I've seen so far, the documentation is thorough. Thorough. The word carried weight, because thoroughness leaves little room for adjustment. Mason lowered himself into his chair. This is being misrepresented, he said. That may be your perspective, the attorney replied carefully, but the material they've submitted will need to be addressed as it stands. The call ended shortly after leaving Mason alone in the quiet of his office. For a moment, he did nothing. Then he reached for the document that had been forwarded to him electronically. He opened it, page after page, structured, organized, precise. His own words appeared in print, stripped of tone, reduced to content. Messages he had sent, statements he had made, all placed within a sequence that revealed something he had not intended to show. Not in isolation, but in accumulation. He scrolled further. The section referencing the Langford house appeared exactly as described. No exaggeration, no omission, just sequence and evidence. Mason leaned back, staring at the screen. For the first time, the situation no longer felt like something that could be redirected through conversation, because it had already moved beyond conversation. Across the city, Abigail had already left Carter and Lowell. There was no need for her to remain. Everything that required action had been set in motion. She walked along the street without urgency, her pace steady, her attention directed forward rather than back. There was no sense of victory, no visible release of tension, only a quiet recalibration. Because what had changed was not her position, it was the structure around it. For months, she had observed, recorded, and allowed the pattern to reveal itself. Now that pattern had been defined, not by her voice, but by the record she had built. Mason, still seated in his office, continued to scroll through the document, each page narrowing the space available to reinterpret what had already been established, each line removing another assumption. He reached the final section and stopped. The realization did not arrive all at once, but when it settled, it carried a clarity he could not dismiss. This was not a reaction. This was a system, and systems once activated do not respond to negotiation. They proceed. The number did not appear immediately. It was not written in large print or placed at the beginning of any document where it might demand attention through scale alone. Instead, it revealed itself gradually embedded within layers of disclosures, references, and structures that required patience to understand. For someone accustomed to direct figures and visible assets, the realization did not come as a single moment of clarity, but as a series of corrections that became increasingly difficult to reconcile. Mason Cole sat in his office long after the initial shock of the filing had settled into something quieter and more complex. The document remained open on his screen, its structure still intact, its tone unchanged no matter how many times he revisited it. He had moved past the sections that described behavior and evidence. Those, while uncomfortable, still existed within a framework he believed he could challenge. It was the financial section that began to alter that belief. At first, he approached it with the same confidence he had always applied to numbers. Accounts, balances, distributions. He expected to find what he already understood, perhaps arranged differently, perhaps framed more formally, but fundamentally recognizable. What he encountered did not align with that expectation. The first indication was subtle, a reference to a holding entity he did not recognize. It appeared in a list of structured assets, described not in detail, but in relation to something larger. Mason paused, scrolling back to confirm that he had not missed an earlier explanation. There was none. He moved forward again, encountering another reference, then another, each connected, each pointing toward a structure that extended beyond the accounts he had previously reviewed. Mason leaned closer to the screen, his focus narrowing. This was not a discrepancy. It was an omission, not in the document. In his understanding, he reached for his phone and called his attorney again. "I need you to walk me through the financial section," he said, as soon as the line connected. There was no hesitation on the other end. "I was expecting that," the attorney replied. "Have you reached the disclosures tied to Whitmore Holdings?" "I'm looking at it now," Mason said. "What is this?" A brief pause followed, not out of uncertainty but out of consideration. "It's the primary structure through which her family assets are managed," the attorney said. "And it is significantly larger than anything reflected in your shared accounts." Mason did not respond immediately. "How large?" he asked. The answer came without emphasis. "Based on the documentation provided, the total valuation of the network of entities connected to that structure is approximately $5 billion. The number settled into the space between them without distortion. $5 billion. Mason's gaze remained fixed on the screen, but the figures in front of him no longer held their previous meaning. "That's not possible," he said, his voice lower, now less certain. "It is," the attorney replied, "and it is well documented." Mason scrolled again, this time with a different intention. Not to confirm, to understand. The document outlined the structure with the same precision applied to every other section. Trusts layered within holding companies, controlling interests in private firms. Long-term investments positioned across multiple sectors. Each element connected, each protected through legal frameworks designed to ensure continuity and separation. There was no exaggeration, no ambiguity, only structure. "She never mentioned any of this," Mason said. Mason leaned back in his chair, his hand still holding the phone, his attention no longer fixed on any single point. For the first time since he had opened the document, he was no longer looking for inconsistencies. He was confronting absence. Not what was there, what he had never seen. The silence on the line extended for a moment longer. Then the attorney spoke again. "This changes the context of everything," he said. "Not just financially, but legally." Mason did not need that explained. because the implication was already clear. Access, control, assumption. All of it had been based on a structure that existed only within the limits of his understanding. "I need time to review this," Mason said finally. "You have time to respond," the attorney replied, "but not to delay the process. They've structured this carefully." Mason ended the call. The office felt different now. Not smaller, but less certain. He stood and walked toward the window, looking out at the city as he had done countless times before. From this height, everything still appeared ordered, still aligned with the image he had built his life around. But the image no longer held the same weight, because it was no longer complete. Across the city, the same information had already been reviewed, not with surprise, but with familiarity. At Carter and Lowell, the financial disclosures had been part of the preparation from the beginning. Jonathan Carter had ensured that every element was presented with clarity, not for impact, but for accuracy. Elise Grant had confirmed each valuation, each structure, each layer of protection. There were no gaps, no vulnerabilities exposed, only information that had always existed now placed into context where it could no longer be overlooked. Abigail had reviewed the same section earlier that morning. She had not lingered on it, not because it was insignificant, but because it was already known. The number itself did not define her position. It simply quantified it. When Jonathan had asked if she wanted any adjustments made to how the disclosures were presented, she had declined. "It doesn't need emphasis," she had said. He had understood. Because emphasis suggests persuasion, and persuasion was not required. The truth, once documented, did not need to be highlighted. It only needed to be visible. Later that afternoon, Mason received another call, this time from Kevin Hartley. Kevin said, his tone less casual than usual. "I just reviewed something that came through." Mason did not ask what. "I've seen it," he replied. There was a pause. Then Kevin spoke again, more carefully. "I didn't know," he said. Mason closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. "Neither did I," he said. The admission settled heavily, not because it was unexpected, but because it confirmed what could no longer be denied. Kevin exhaled quietly. "That changes things," he said. Mason did not respond, because there was nothing to add. The call ended shortly after. Mason remained where he was, his phone still in his hand, the document still open on his desk. For years he had operated with a clear understanding of his position. He had built his career on that understanding, refined it, expanded it, relied on it. Now that understanding had been replaced, not challenged. Replaced, because what he had believed to be the foundation of his control had never been the foundation at all. It had been a surface. And beneath that surface, something far larger had existed without his awareness. Abigail Whitmore had not changed. Her position had not shifted. Her control had not increased. It had always been there. What had changed was visibility, and visibility once established alters everything connected to it. Mason returned to his desk and sat down slowly. The document remained open, unchanged, but no longer interpretable in the same way, because the assumptions he had used to read it were no longer valid. And without those assumptions, the structure it revealed could not be dismissed. It could only be acknowledged. The resolution did not arrive with a single decision. There was no moment in which a judge spoke, and everything shifted at once, no visible turning point that marked the end of conflict and the beginning of closure. Instead, it unfolded through a sequence of actions that followed the structure already in place. Each step was measured, each response anticipated, each outcome shaped less by argument and more by what had already been established. By the time the first hearing was scheduled, the framework of the case had already limited what could be contested. Inside the courtroom, the environment was restrained, almost understated. There were no raised voices, no dramatic gestures, no attempt to persuade through performance. The proceedings moved with the same controlled rhythm that had defined everything leading up to this point. Abigail sat beside Jonathan Carter, her posture steady, her presence quiet. She did not look toward Mason when he entered. She did not need to. Mason took his seat across from her, accompanied by his attorney. His expression remained composed, but there was a difference in how he held himself now. The confidence that had once seemed effortless required more effort to maintain. It was still there, but no longer unexamined. The judge entered, and the room shifted into formal stillness. The case was called. Jonathan stood first, His presentation was direct, structured, and devoid of unnecessary emphasis. He did not attempt to frame the situation as extraordinary. He did not rely on emotional appeal. Instead, he outlined the sequence of documented behavior, the escalation point, and the supporting evidence that aligned with each claim. He referenced the emails not as isolated messages, but as part of a consistent pattern. He introduced the audio recording without commentary, allowing the content to define its own weight. When the footage from the Langford house was presented, it was done without dramatization, the visual record speaking with a clarity that required no interpretation. At each stage, the documentation supported the structure. Nothing extended beyond what could be verified. Mason's attorney responded with restraint, attempting to reframe the situation as a misunderstanding, a moment of misjudgment rather than a pattern of behavior. He emphasized context, suggested that stress and external pressure had contributed to the incident, and argued that the actions did not reflect a broader intent. It was a reasonable approach. Under different circumstances, it might have created space for reconsideration, but the space had already been defined, because context had already been established. The emails showed progression. The audio revealed tone. The footage confirmed action. And the alignment between them left little room for reinterpretation. The judge did not interrupt often, but when she did, it was to clarify specifics rather than to explore argument. "Is there any dispute regarding the authenticity of the submitted materials?" she asked at one point. Mason's attorney hesitated briefly before responding. "No, Your Honor." That single answer narrowed the scope of the case further. Because once authenticity is accepted, the discussion shifts from whether something occurred to how it is understood. And in this case, understanding had already been structured by evidence. The financial aspects followed a similar path. Jonathan presented the disclosures with the same measured precision, outlining the separation of assets, the structure of ownership, and the protections already in place. He did not emphasize the scale of Abigail's holdings. He did not need to. The documentation spoke for itself. Mason's attorney reviewed the same material, but there was little to challenge. The structures had been established long before the marriage. The protections were clear. The distinction between shared and independent assets was legally defined and consistently maintained. There was no ambiguity, only confirmation. As the proceedings continued, Mason remained silent. Not because he had nothing to say, but because the structure of the moment did not allow for it. Everything that might have been argued had already been addressed within the documentation. Everything that might have been reframed had already been fixed within the sequence of evidence. For the first time, he was not directing the outcome. He was observing it. Abigail, seated across from him, did not look toward him even once. Her attention remained forward, her expression unchanged. There was no satisfaction in her stillness. No sense of victory. Only presence. Because this was not a moment she had created. It was a moment that had resulted from what had already occurred. The hearing concluded without spectacle. The judge outlined the next steps, confirming temporary measures that would remain in place as the case moved forward. Financial restrictions were upheld. Documentation requirements were reinforced. The process would continue, but its direction had already been established. Outside the courtroom, the transition back into the ordinary world felt almost abrupt. The hallway was quiet, the movement of people controlled and deliberate. Mason stepped out first, his attorney speaking beside him in low, measured tones. The conversation was not urgent, but it carried a different quality than before. Less certainty. More calculation. Abigail followed moments later, accompanied by Jonathan. "There will be additional filings," Jonathan said. "But the framework is secure." Abigail nodded. "I expected that," she replied. Jonathan glanced at her briefly. "Do you have any questions?" he asked. She considered for a moment, then shook her head. No, because there was nothing unclear. Everything had unfolded exactly as it had been prepared. They walked together toward the exit, the distance between them and the courtroom increasing with each step. Outside, the city continued as it always did, unaffected by what had just been decided within a room that most people would never enter. Mason remained behind for a moment longer, not because he needed to, but because leaving required acknowledging something he was still processing. His attorney placed a hand lightly on the folder they carried. "We'll review next steps," he said. "There are still elements to address." Mason nodded. But his attention was not on the words. It was on the realization that had settled quietly. without announcement over the course of the hearing. This was not a situation that could be corrected through explanation. It was not something that could be negotiated back into balance, because balance had never been what he believed it was. The structure had always existed. He had simply misunderstood his place within it. Outside, Abigail stepped onto the sidewalk and paused briefly, not to reflect, not to reconsider, but to orient. Then she continued forward. There was no need to look back, because nothing behind her required attention anymore. The process would continue. The outcome would follow, but the essential shift had already occurred, not in the courtroom, but in the quiet alignment of truth with record. And once that alignment is complete, judgment becomes less about decision and more about recognition. The final stage did not arrive with noise. There were no announcements, no public acknowledgement, no visible moment where the outcome declared itself in a way others could observe and interpret. Instead, it settled gradually the way something inevitable does when it has already been decided long before it is formally concluded. The paperwork was completed over the course of several weeks, each document reviewed with the same precision that had defined every step of the process. Agreements were finalized, signatures placed where they were required, and the legal separation moved from active procedure into completed record. Abigail Whitmore did not attend the final administrative filing in person. She did not need to. Jonathan Carter handled it as he had handled everything else, with a clarity that required no supervision. When he called to confirm that it was done, his tone carried no emphasis. "It's complete," he said. Abigail listened. "Thank you," she replied. There was no further discussion, because there was nothing left to clarify. Across the city, Mason Cole received the same confirmation from his attorney. The language was similar, direct, final. The difference was not in what was said. It was in how it was received. Mason sat in his office, the same office where he had once believed every variable could be managed through calculation and control. The documents in front of him now represented something different. Not a situation to be navigated, but an outcome that had already taken shape. He had reviewed the terms multiple times. They were not punitive. They were not excessive. They were exact. Assets were separated according to structures that had existed long before the marriage. Financial exposure was limited to what had been clearly defined as shared. Obligations were outlined with precision, leaving no ambiguity regarding responsibility. Nothing in the agreement attempted to diminish him beyond what his own actions had already established, and that more than anything left no space for argument, because there was nothing to challenge, only something to accept. He closed the folder slowly and leaned back in his chair, his gaze moving toward the window out of habit rather than intention. The city beyond it remained unchanged, its movement steady, its rhythm uninterrupted. For years he had measured his position within that landscape with certainty. Now that measurement had shifted, not in scale, but in accuracy. Across town, Abigail had already moved on to something else. The apartment overlooking the Hudson was no longer part of her routine. Its clean lines and reflective surfaces had served their purpose for a time, but they no longer held relevance. She had arranged for everything to be handled efficiently without disruption, ensuring that what needed to be closed was closed, and what needed to be retained was retained. There had been no emotional farewell, no lingering presence, only transition. She now occupied a different space. Not larger, not more visible, but quieter. The kind of place where attention was not drawn outward, but held within. Large windows still framed the city, but from a different angle. The light entered differently here, softer in the mornings, less reflective in the evenings. It was not designed to impress. It was designed to function. Elise Grant visited once briefly to review final confirmations. "All structures remain intact," she said, placing a folder on the table. "No residual exposure." Abigail nodded. "Thank you," she replied. Elise hesitated for a moment, then added, "Do you plan to take a more active role again?" Abigail considered the question, not as a decision, but as a continuation. "Yes," she said. Gradually. Elise inclined her head slightly. "That aligns with current projections," she said. There was no further discussion, because the answer required no expansion. Later that afternoon, Abigail sat near the window, a document open on her laptop. It was not related to the case. It was part of something else, something that had continued quietly in the background while everything else had unfolded. A report. long-term, detailed. The kind of work she had once stepped away from not because she could not do it, but because she had chosen to. Now she returned to it without announcement, without transition, as though the pause had never altered the trajectory. Her phone remained on the table beside her. It had not been silent. Messages had arrived. Some expected, some not. A few from people who had only now begun to understand who she was. She did not respond to most of them. Not out of avoidance, but because response was not required. Recognition once delayed does not demand acknowledgement. It simply arrives. Mason's name appeared once. A message sent days after the final filing. It was brief. "We should talk." Abigail read it, then set the phone down. No reply followed, because there was nothing left to discuss. The conversation he was asking for belonged to a structure that no longer existed, and she did not return to structures that had already been defined and closed. As evening settled, the city outside shifted again, lights emerging in patterns that mirrored movement below. From her vantage point, Abigail observed it without distraction, her attention steady, her presence unchanged. There was no sense of victory, no reflection on what had been lost or gained, only an understanding that some outcomes do not restore balance. They reveal it. What Mason had believed was control had never been control. What others had perceived as silence had never been absence. And what Abigail had carried quietly throughout the duration of the marriage had never required validation. It had only required time. Time for patterns to form. Time for records to align. Time for truth to move from observation into structure. Now that structure was complete, not because it had been forced, but because it had been allowed to reveal itself. Abigail closed her laptop and stood moving toward the window as the last light of the day settled across the buildings. For a moment she remained there, still, not reflecting on what had ended, but recognizing what remained. Then she turned and continued forward, without hesitation, without announcement, with nothing behind her that required return. There are moments in life that do not announce themselves when they begin. They arrive quietly, often mistaken for something ordinary, something temporary, something that can be explained or adjusted with time. But as those moments accumulate, as patterns take shape and decisions are made in silence, they begin to define something deeper. This story was never about a single act. It was never about the coffee, the argument, or even the courtroom. It was about the space between what is seen and what is understood. About how easily perception can replace truth when no one questions it. And about how quietly truth can wait until it is no longer possible to ignore. Abigail did not raise her voice. She did not demand recognition. She did not try to correct every assumption made about her. Instead, she observed. She recorded. She allowed time to reveal what words could not change. And when the moment came, she did not need to prove anything. Because everything had already been proven. There is a kind of strength that does not appear dramatic. It does not interrupt. It does not force itself into attention. It remains steady, even when it is misunderstood, even when it is overlooked. And when it finally moves, it does so with a clarity that leaves no need for explanation. If this story stayed with you even in a quiet way, you can take a moment to reflect on it. You might consider where you are in the world right now, what time it is as you finish this, and how often the most important things go unnoticed until they matter most. And if you find value in stories that unfold slowly, that rely not on noise but on truth, you are always welcome to return, to listen, and to continue following what comes next.